Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Democratic View. I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and with me today is an old friend in the sense that we've known each other for a while, and his name is Karl Grossman. He is a professor at SUNY Old Westbury, as well as a reporter for many of our papers around. And what you teach at SUNY Westbury is investigative reporting.
I teach investigative reporting. I have a course in environmental journalism. I teach actually TV and radio journalism. A course I've taught through the years. Politics of media is an interesting course to teach, where I talk about issues of corporate control of media and what a Rupert Murdoch means in terms of our free press and sexism in media traditionally and racism in media, all involve the politics of media. Also run an internship program where I place students at newspapers and magazines, on websites, at PR companies all over the New York metro area. Old Westbury is just 25 miles from the media capital of the world. So we're able to, at Old Westbury, have our students work at NBC and CBS and CNN, and I've been there almost 40 years. So I practice journalism still, and I teach it.
And we all know that at one point there was a daily paper called the Long Island Press. And as a matter of fact, one time, didn't you find some archives of the Long Island Press that had some of your earlier work?
Oh, yeah. Well, I worked, that was my daily newspaper experience. I started off on a weekly newspaper on Long Island, the Babylon Town Leader. Was there a couple of years, and we did a program.
I remember that paper too.
It was a spunky weekly paper, and well, when I got there, Robert Moses had just announced he was going to build a highway on Fire Island.
That's why I remember it, because I was involved in that.
Yeah, and the mainstream, major newspapers, the New York Times, Newsday, in fact, the Long Island Press, the paper I finally went to, the Daily Long Island Press, were for the Moses Road. Indeed, Moses really had the media of the New York metro area, as Robert Caro writes in the Power Broker, in his pocket.
Yes.
But the Babylon Leader, he didn't, and he happened to live in Babylon, so my first job came just as Moses announced he was going to build this highway the length of Fire Island, which would have just paved over these wonderful communities, these magical communities.
4 lanes.
4 big.
My house would have fallen into the ocean.
Well, it would
because where I was very narrow.
Yeah, but Water Island was actually narrower than on Fire Island than the road. Beautiful pieces of nature, sunken forest would have been paved over. But Moses claimed that a road would anchor the beach. In fact, what I did for a couple of years was to show that, no, a road wouldn't anchor the beach. Barrier beaches really have to move with nature. And if you look at the Jones Beach stretch, the road there, wow, did Superstorm Sandy do a number on that Ocean Parkway. And indeed, I also found, this is years ago, that to keep Ocean Parkway in one place, it was the Jones Beach State Parkway Authority would use bulldozers in the middle of the night to push sand from the beach and from the bayside alongside the Ocean Parkway to keep it in shape. So a road wouldn't anchor the beach. The best thing for Fire Island, this is what my articles pointed to, would be a Fire Island National Seashore. And that finally came into being, and from there I went to the Daily Long Island Press. And
Long Island, the National Seashore was a dream come true for those of us on Fire Island.
Well, when I go by a ferry to the beach, to Fire Island, which we don't do that often, if every few years, and I see the beauty of Fire Island preserved rather than it being a ribbon of sand just underneath a 4-lane highway, I really feel, well, very proud of my part
Me too.
And
I was a part of it also.
yeah,
I
well,
fought it with groups of people, including Geraldine Ferraro, who lived in Saltaire, and we all got together and we did things to make sure that that did not happen. Charles Collingwood was also there, and
Reginald Rose, I interviewed him in connection to
yes,
Theodore White, the writer.
oh, he lived right in Fair Harbor.
I was up to my neck in that fight, and it was a combination of grassroots action by the folks on Fire Island and some folks on the mainland. I mean, it was hard for me as a reporter to find a public official on Long Island who had the courage to take on Robert Moses, but I found a few. Charlie Dominy, who became the Brookhaven town supervisor, he stood up to Moses, and he was for a seashore. Tom Harwood, who was the Islip town supervisor. Prescott Huntington was a state assembly man from St. James. He too was for a seashore and against the road. But actually the list of public officials with the courage to stand up to Moses ends about there.
And by the way, that was also about the same time when they started talking about the Fire Island study, which became what we call FIMP, Fire Island to Montauk. It really started as Fire Island, and how they were going to pump the sand up from out in the beach, out beyond, and what they were going to do, and it's going to be going on pretty soon. We're going to be talking about that at the end of in Montauk, I think in a couple of weeks, and we will be finally. I thought I would die before it ever came to fruition. I mean, really, it's since the 60s.
Well, that's where I came in, because not only did Moses announce the road, but in conjunction with his announcement came the plan. It was Fire Island to Montauk Point, and they would dump sand all along they call it beach nourishment. They were going to dump sand, which would wash away in storms, of course, but they would dump sand, and they'd build jetties, stone jetties, which they call groins.
Yes,
when they're built on
we had them in Ocean Beach, and if you go to the town next to it, it was like this, and scoured out. And I can't pass this without talking about the nor'easter of '96, when I walked from Lonelyville to Fair Harbor, and there was house upon house upon house in the shore. I said, I think I have to respect the Atlantic Ocean. Very powerful.
Well, John Klein, who was a Suffolk County executive back in the 70s, when the Army Corps of Engineers was constructing a bunch of the groins, ended up going West Hampton. And he said, this is like arm wrestling with God, trying to take on the ocean. Each groin at that time cost $1 million a groin. Now they're talking about the Fire Island to Montauk project. It was in the tens of millions when I got into this, and this is back in 1962.
Yes.
Now it's $1.2 billion of taxpayer money to go to dump sand. They're not talking, as far as I can tell in the preliminary draft, about groins anymore, but the Army is so into, well, I mean, it's a combination of military people and engineers, quite a combination, who think that they can arm wrestle with God, and you really can't take on.
I like that phrase, arm wrestle with God.
Yeah.
You know, one of the reasons why I asked you to come today was because you had a most interesting column about the Freedom of Information Act on both the state and national level. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that, how it started, what it means, what its implications are, and how we as citizens can use it as a tool.
Oh, it's a very important tool. As I remember, now this is back in the 60s, we were trying to find out from the people at the Long Island State Park Commission how much money went into this fortifying of the Ocean Parkway, and it turned out they had hidden the numbers, all this money, in the books of the Jones Beach State Parkway Authority. And in any case, this is the 60s. This is before the Freedom of Information law this is a state law in New York State, came into being. If we had FOIL, if we had the Freedom of Information law, we could have just zeroed right in, demanded to get the accounting of the money spent on fortifying the Ocean Parkway. But it all begins really with the federal law. This is the Freedom of Information Act. That's FOIA, acronym FOIA. And that was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, July 4th, Independence Day, 1966. It took effect in 67. Well, the credit really should belong to a congressman from California. His name was John Morse. He is considered the father of the Freedom of Information Act. I tell my students this is the best thing to come along for investigative reporting, for journalism, in fact, since the typewriter. And it isn't just journalists who can use it. Anybody can use FOIA or FOIL. And it's very powerful. Until that time, there wasn't a presumption that the public, that the people had the right to governmental information. And it was like pulling teeth to get any government information. But Congressman Morse felt that the public, they call it transparency now, that government should be transparent, that the people should have the right.
I think I should also call it democracy, don't you think?
Very much so. It's what democracy should be about, people's having a right to know and to learn and to then take action on the basis of information. So, and Morse, let me note, was given a very hard time. In fact, Lyndon Johnson's Justice Department fought having the Freedom of Information Act. Morse, he was in line to become, it said, ultimately the House Speaker. He was on a leadership track. But after his struggle to get FOIA created, he actually never was allowed to chair a House committee. He sacrificed for FOIA. But the sacrifice is so important because on the federal level, with 9 exemptions, and I teach my students in investigative reporting how you use FOIA. And well, the viewer can just go Google Freedom of Information Act, and there's a lot of instructions right online, including instructions provided by the government. And basically, a citizen, and again, reporters use this the most, can ask the government for, you gotta be specific, it can't be a fishing trip, about a certain issue. And if it doesn't violate certain exemptions, the right of privacy, if it's national security and so forth, the government has to provide that information, and quick. And quick. They have to give you a response in a couple of weeks, and they have to provide, I mean, I've used it over and over again, and it's a gold mine for journalism. And then, meanwhile, on the state level, New York State followed up, and others, and all states, but most states, followed up with their own Freedom of Information laws. Here in New York, 73, Committee on Open Government was created, which is headed by the most wonderful attorney and a person committed to open government, Robert Freeman. If you want to use FOIL and you need help, just give a call to Bob Freeman up in Albany. And the way it works with governments in a state, whether it's the town of East Hampton, whether it's the East Hampton Police Department, whether it's the county of Suffolk, whether it's the East Hampton School District. These are entities that have to be created by the state. The state creates Nassau County, actually in 1898, out of Queens, in fact. The state has to create, essentially. If a new village wants to be born, like Mastic Beach became a village about a year ago, you need state permission. So as a result, FOIL, the Freedom of Information Law, applies to all the creatures of the state, not just the state, all the government offshoots of the state. So
you mean all school districts, fire departments, police departments, all of them?
Villages, town. If you want to get information from the village of Sag Harbor, for example, you file under the state Freedom of Information law. Now, there's exemptions there, too. An ongoing criminal investigation. They're not going to give you information about that.
Of course.
But
well,
basically, I mean, that's common sense. But basically, if you want to get specific and you file, and it can be done by email now, there's been changes in recent years in terms of how you go to or by old-fashioned letter, the government has to move quick to provide you with the information. Now, there's been an issue, and that was my column that you referred to. Here in Long Island, there's a group in the city, in Manhattan, called Reclaim New York, and they wanted to get records under FOIL, expenditure records. Essentially, they wanted to get information about checks paid for payment to various vendors from towns and school district and villages on Long Island. And most came through. Most said fine. The town of Islip didn't. The town of Babylon didn't. The Southampton School District didn't, among other school districts that didn't basically comply with FOIL. So Reclaim New York brought a lawsuit in state Supreme Court to go after these entities. And just as we're airing this show, comes the news that the East Hampton School District has agreed to pay a $4,000, well, it's lawyer's fee, but it's money out of the pockets of people of East Hampton School District for lawyer's fee for what Reclaim New York had to undergo to get, I mean, basic records. I mean, who you paid. I mean, that's simple. They weren't asking for some deep, dark secret. Maybe they were, some of these payments, deep, dark secrets. Also, very importantly, in terms of the Southampton School District, and I mentioned this in the column too, the Southampton Press has, the Southampton Press and East Hampton Press are sister papers, part of the Press News Group.
Right.
The Southampton Press basically was forced to bring a lawsuit itself, this newspaper, against the East Hampton School District to, under FOIL, get information. There was a superintendent.
You mean the Southampton School District, not the East Hampton?
Yeah, the Southampton School District.
Yeah.
There was a superintendent there, and his name was Scott Farina. And there were some circumstances that caused Scott Farina to resign, and also to get like a $300,000, what would you call it, a buyout or a payoff or whatever, as part of the package.
I don't know what you call it, because I am aghast at what the superintendents make as an educator out here. It's crazy.
Well, the Southampton Press, for its readers, wanted to know, what's the story? What was the $300,000 for? Why did this superintendent suddenly resign? And what occurred is that the Southampton School District came back and said, under the privacy provision of the Freedom of Information law, we're not going to tell you that. Not going to give you any information about what transpired. And that's not right. I mean, the Southampton Press wasn't asking for Scott Farina's social security number or some sort of, the taxpayers in the Southampton School District, they're paying, you know, for this buyout and all this stuff. And really, the public has a right to know what went down, I feel. And so that's what that lawsuit is about. So the Freedom of Information Act, the Freedom of Information law, really at this point bedrocks in terms of democracy, in terms of transparency. And I've used, as I mentioned, I've used them a lot myself. I'll give you an example. 1985, this is years ago, it was over 30 years ago, I read about 2 space shuttles that were to be launched in 1986, that one being the Challenger, that would have on them space probes that they would loft once they got into these shuttles. Once they got into orbit, they would send off these 2 space probes, which were energized with plutonium. And I read about it. I was in my lazy boy chair reading documents. I do this a lot. And it was in something called the Department of Energy Insider. It was like a newsletter. And the story about these 2 shuttle shots involving plutonium fuel space probes in the newsletter said that the government, NASA, the Department of Energy, and various national laboratories, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos and stuff, 5 national laboratories, had looked into the possibility of an accident on these launches. Now, I had written a few years before a book on nuclear technology and its dangers, cover up what you're not supposed to know about nuclear power. So I know the dangers of plutonium. It's regarded as the most toxic of all radioactive substances. Right. So I sent out a letter under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, to DOE, to NASA, to all the national laboratories, saying that you've done a study about accident consequences and impacts. That's what the story said. I'd like to get that information, you know. Well, this is 1985, early 1985, January, and the laws are great, but just passing a law often isn't enough. And here, and I didn't realize what I had hit upon, was obviously a kind of a hot button issue. They didn't want to talk about what could occur if, well, this was to be Challenger's next mission in May of '86. And if it would have blown up, Challenger, not in May of '86, but January of '86, I mean, if it would have blown up, not in January '86, but in May of '86, with this plutonium aboard, and the plutonium would have been dispersed.
It would have been an atomic disaster.
Well, you wouldn't want to go to Disney for about 100 years. I mean, it wouldn't have been just 7 brave astronauts dying. It would have been many more.
Yeah, because a lot of people may not remember, but the Challenger was one of our spaceships that blew up.
It exploded right after launch. In any case, what the Department of Energy and NASA, the position they took with the national labs to me, and it was all led by the DOE, the Department of Energy, is they wouldn't give me this information because they went to some exemptions under the Freedom of Information Act that it shouldn't be used for commercial interest, and I, as a journalist, would be making money selling the story or being paid from, I mean, come on, that's some stretch. And then this is no exemption at all, that the information was highly technical. And I fought it and I fought it. In fact, in the area newspapers, in my column, which I've been writing for decades, started at the Long Island Press in 1969, my Long Island column, and when the press went out, the Daily Long Island Press in '77, various weekly newspapers all over Long Island took it. I mean, you can see my column in
yes.
the East Hampton Press or the Sag Harbor Express or the Shelter Island Reporter and so forth. And I wrote about this cover up, why don't they? And finally, in late '85, under the Freedom of Information Act, there in the Sag Harbor Post Office was this huge cardboard box of records of what would occur if, with the plutonium fuel space probe aboard, the Challenger and the second shuttle had an accident on launch, like I asked, on launch in the lower atmosphere, upper atmosphere, fell back from orbit to Earth and so forth. And basically, it would have been, like you say, a disaster. In fact, there was one loose leaf book here that was given to me, which was to rate the numbers of people killed, so like deaths, injuries, all this stuff, property damage, and where the numbers were supposed to be, they whited out the numbers, and it put exempt 1. The first exemption under the Freedom of Information Act is national security. So as a matter of national security, they claimed, I mean, I took the position as a matter of...
But they removed
You had to use an ounce of whiteout. I took the position as a matter of national insecurity, they should give me those figures. In any case, I also teach ethics in my journalism courses. I get all this information. NASA, DOE, and these documents said the likelihood of a catastrophic shuttle accident is 1 in 100,000. So there could be disaster, but it's so highly unlikely. So
one happened, didn't it?
Well, I didn't move on this story, if you call it a story, until it was January, I think the day 28, 1986. I was on my way to SUNY Old Westbury to teach my investigative reporting course. And I hear on the radio that the Challenger blew up. And I stopped actually at a P.C. Richards store. And I saw that iconic image of technological failure, of this thing exploding, and poor Chris McAuliffe's parents in the stands in agony. And I called The Nation magazine. I've written through the years for The Nation. And I said, you guys know that the next mission of the Challenger was going to be a nuclear mission. And they said, Karl, can you do an edit on it? And I did. The Lethal Shuttle is what they headed it in The Nation. And I've been on this issue for, well, that was 86. It's been a long time I've been on the issue because it's not all over. But again, if it wasn't for the Freedom of Information law, if it was Freedom of Information Act, I would be, when I finally went with it, I had all the data. And it turns out, incidentally, that 1 in 100,000 projection of a catastrophic shuttle accident. 2 months later, NASA changed that to 1 in 76.
Oh,
1 in 76.
Oh, wow.
Which turned out to be the right figure, because
Yeah.
out of 150 launches, there were 2 catastrophes.
Well, now that you have given us this information about this wonderful tool, I hope that people out there will understand that this is something that we have to make sure that we have a democracy here all the time. And what was that man's name again?
John Morse, Congressman John Morse of California.
And the name of the man here in New York that if we have a problem?
Oh yeah, he's just great. Robert Freeman, F-R-E-E-M-A-N. He's up in Albany, Committee on Open Government. He's just wonderful.
Great. Well, thank you, Karl, for another very interesting talk, because I really think that people should understand that we have some protections here for our democracy. Thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
One more
Always.
time.
Always.
Always.